Alright, what's up everybody? So, here's what we got going today. So, I'm basically going to define what a hypermobile athlete is in my brain, common misconceptions, common complaints, my experience with hypermobility, training modifications, and then the case study. So, with that being said, is Google, straight off the bat, hypermobility is a condition of having an unusual or abnormal great range of motion in a joint and or joints. I'm going to kind of elaborate on that a little bit. So I'm going to kind of take a little bit further. So a congenital or inherent amount of laxity. So actually I want to think about it as like mobility itself. That lies on a continuum across joints and then across other humans. So what I mean by that is like there are many people that have laxity in one joint and then not in another. Or a hypermobility for one person is not necessarily a hypermobility for another person. So you need to basically have some sort of frame of reference on what a hypermobility is, I guess, per person, and then what does it matter? So again, in swimmers, shoulders, hypermobility, I would expect that to some degree. Hip flexors, or in your guys' world, I guess, would be like dorsiflexion or something of the nature, is that they might not be hypermobile there. From a congenital standpoint, though, is that these three lovely humans, they have congenital hypermobility. They can move through the roof. So then that then matters how you guys then dictate training moving forward for whatever athlete that is. So that's why I'm going to change that definition slightly.
So basically you're saying like hypermobility definition differs per athlete, per individual, like how you define hypermobility. So for example, humeral ER on a pitcher would be hypermobile on us, but in the MLB it's not hypermobility, is what you're saying.
Yes, but even then, taking it one step further, so that person might have 140 degrees of external rotation.
Yeah.
In normal human world, that's a hypermobile athlete.
Right.
In my sport, it might not be.
It's not.
But then even taking it one step further, they might have 140 on both shoulders. So then it's not a hypermobility at all because within their body frame, it's not considered hypermobility.
But if there's asymmetry, 140, 100, then it's hypermobile.
To a degree. Yeah, absolutely. So just having a little bit more context of what hypermobility is.
Yeah.
And I basically just kind of thought about it a little bit more on the conversation that we had. Because like I feel that I'm having a hard time kind of defining what hypermobility is, but when I think about it on a continuum of person to person, human to human, but then joint to joint, but then I even have to take it one step further to sport.
Yeah.
So it all kind of matters. So again, there isn't one single form of hypermobility, and then again, it can be born, so that's congenital. You were born with a certain amount of hypermobility, or it could be a learned trait. The learned trait is the sport. So like a baseball player, they are going to gain more external rotation just because of the 5-ounce weight over and over again. That's where they're going to gain laxity. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's hypermobility though. So just kind of creating some sort of frame of reference there. Okay, so then the parameters that I practice within. So you guys got basically a summarization of there. Like when I'm thinking about it from a hypermobility standpoint, is I'm running through all those factors at any given moment. Most of the time in my world, I think about it as more of a neurological issue, not necessarily a structural issue. So if somebody has hypermobility, I can't change that, nor do I want to. If it's affecting them in a negative way, where do I import? Okay, so then I'm choosing what I need to basically try to bring back more normal, right? So hypermobility in my world, I think about it as a continuum, right? Like averages, law of averages, 80% is normal. Okay, hypermobility is probably on that 5% fringe on either side. How do we get them back more normal? But hopefully the more normal helps them out for whatever they're trying to accomplish. So again, meet the athletes where they're at. That's trying to basically try to learn how to cater a little bit more individualization. That's the sexy word for strength training these days. Again, hypermobility versus relative hypermobility. So if one joint is, most of the time others are also. So again, if you guys need a fast track on what hypermobility is, ask any one of these brothers to move and they can pretty much do it throughout any joint. But again, bony versus capsular, that depends on the sport. So that's relative in reference to the same one person. Okay, misconceptions. I was sitting on my couch yesterday laughing because I think that the common, I guess, ask or hypermobility, or I guess what you guys would come across is like, how do I get more like Michael Phelps? You're not. And that's a hard conversation to have, right? He's literally the perfect blend of inherent traits, trained traits, hypermobility, strength. It's a perfect storm. So his like morphology, and I think they did a study not too long ago, right after his last Olympics, like his proportions, it's one of one. He was made basically to swim. At the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't help that person that's walking through the door at some capacity, right? So like, hey, if they're tight, we'll create more range of motion. If they're weak, get them stronger. If they're slow, get them faster. There are traits that you can help. With that being said, is trying to make sure the athlete is inching closer to the true north. So perfect opportunity here to kind of segue is even today, right? So I saw some people like, oh, I just feel tight. What does that mean? So gaining mobility or trying to gain range of motion for the sake of gaining range of motion doesn't necessarily always mean it's going to help you progress. Our job, my job, your guys' job is to try to help that person shave 5 seconds or qualify for this team or qualify for this meet. That happens by trying to figure out what they need in order to get there. Is it mobility? Is it not mobility? What they say versus what you guys do to import most of the time are not the same thing. So then it's trying to tease out that information and make sure that it gets more true north. So that's what I mean by that, is trying to make sure that if it's a mobility issue, that's one thing, but trying to make sure that you're importing in to try to help them progress to wherever they're going. This is kind of arrogant for me to put there, and I didn't really have a better way to say it, is try to learn from people that have done it before you. Stuff like this, or if you guys have any questions, and I'm not saying that I know everything, but I know some things. And if I don't know the answer, I'll damn sure figure out, try to help you guys to try and find it. I'm not going to play the video. You guys have seen it. His pre-game ritual or his pre-jump ritual, right? He goes into this like crazy extension and then he does the flaps. Okay, cool. People look at it as a mobility exercise. I look at it as like, it's just something that he does to make him feel more comfortable, good in the zone. That's what I always do. Okay, cool. Like, cause even when you do play the video, nothing going into extension here in my brain would help you swim faster. If anything, it would almost like detract you, right? You're going into a ton of extension, which you already do anyways, and then you're going into a bunch of flexion. Everything you guys do is an extension. So like in theory, like would I tell somebody to do that before they get in the pool? No. And then, oh yeah, by the way, he can flap his arms. Like I can't even reach across, but he can touch his fingers together this way. So again, I think when people look at that and they're like, hey, like that's my first integration into swimming mobility from a strength training perspective, I think it's a really, really poor example. But for him, again, is that it might just be one of those things where it's like, okay, pre-meet, okay, I do that, okay, now I'm zoned in. So again, it's still beneficial. It's just trying to figure out why it's beneficial. I would honestly say there's no reason to do it. If anything, it's probably worse. Because again, and I'll get to it here in a second, is that like his mobility for that movement, I think detracts almost a little bit, but because that's what he does, it helps him. Yeah. Awesome. Common complaints is just basically just things that I hear. I always feel tight. I'm not flexible. I feel that I always need to stretch. I try to mobilize to stay loose. YouTube told me. Insert uninformed person, again, trying to be a little bit of a dick, sorry, told me to do so. So again, these are the common complaints, but those complaints are just words to me. It doesn't necessarily mean that it always is. So again, when I'm talking about here in the next kind of conversation, is that I look at it a little bit differently. What are they trying to do about it? They're stretching constantly, mobility work. Massage gun's my personal favorite because it's like the worst thing that a hypermobile person can do. So in my brain, what if I like a Theragun, hypervolt, anything like that, you're gonna downregulate the nervous system. Okay, so that's how you basically create mobility, is that it provides a window of opportunity for you to gain a little bit of range of motion. And it feels good, so why would you not do that? Problem is though, is that they need more neural. They don't need less. So then the problem is that they do this like, okay, that's going to make you feel good. Now I feel better, but then it's actually it's detracting away from them ability to basically use the muscle properly. So then if you're down regulating a muscle that already needs to be used and then they can't do that even more, probably not the best idea.
That's for a hypermobile athlete you're talking about?
Any athlete. So like there's a big study, like my best frame of reference is my mentor works for the White Sox. Okay, so Theragun or Hypervolt actually signed a deal with MLB that we're going to put guns in every dugout, right? What happened was that they had like a 30% increase in soft tissue injuries, hamstring and calf strains.
Jeez.
Okay, so how does that happen? And then like we basically had this long discussion, and he's like, so like, what do you think happened? I'm like, I bet you they did it in between innings. They downregulated the nervous system. They gained a little bit more range of motion that they can basically have capacity for injury. And he's like, that's exactly what happened. So we took him out of our dugout immediately. Okay, cool. So then when we apply it to your guys' space, a hypermobile athlete is going to always try to find or chase the rabbit of, I need to feel better. The problem is though, is that they're going to try to do everything else around it instead of addressing the actual issue.
They need to feel better because they're constantly feeling tension.
That's what they're feeling. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's real, right? So a perfect example would be Skylar, is that he always felt tight. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what was happening. But then when you take a Theragun to a kid like him, he's going to do that. I'm going to feel better subjectively, therefore it has to be good for me. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually good for me.
Why do they feel tension?
Next slide. Okay, so here's the metaphor that I'm looking for. Funny enough is I try to use this metaphor. With that being said, here's the metaphor that I use, okay? So I use a donut. Basically, this is how they feel. So they feel in the red. Think about it as a range of motion. Okay, so the red is what they feel, the yellow is where they need to be, in the middle. The blue is what they have. So they're basically trying to make the red circle into the blue circle. How does that happen? They think it comes from mobility work. They think it comes from soft tissue work. They think it comes from stretching. They think it comes from XYZ from the previous slide. Problem is though, is that the only way that the red is going to become the blue, in my world, or how I think about it, is trying to get them more normal. Working in ranges of motion that are pretty standard. Loading a joint, creating mobility through strength training. Basically getting their brain to basically tell them that it's okay to move. That's basically what happens. So here's the metaphor that I draw it on every single whiteboard. I talk about it with every single hypermobile patient at some capacity is that you're trying to chase an impossible thing the wrong way. So then let's basically kind of reroute them. It's not going to be perfect, but reroute them in the opposite direction. It tends to work out pretty well.
Closing the gap between passive and active range of motion.
As much as possible.
Talking about.
As much as possible, because they have a bigger continuum. The normal people are here.
Yeah.
They're here.
But they can only
They
access
think that they're here, and they're not. So, but then when you ask them to move and squat, they squat through the roof. And they do all this movement. Again, Scour, perfect example. Like, he moves his shoulder blades more than anybody I've ever seen. But it doesn't feel good. Okay, so then how do we do that? I constrain his ability to move. Oh my God, I feel better.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm stronger. So that's like this metaphor. It's not perfect, but it's the best way that I can like visually write it down to the point where it's like, okay, it makes sense. As far as I'm aware. And that's just like, this is anecdotal. This isn't necessarily, it is research based to a little bit, but the more that I spend time trying to treat neural adaptations, I tend to do better faster. That's not even just hypermobility. That's just like with any patient. So like even when we were talking with what's his face, Lionel, is that like that's a neurological issue because his brain's trying to lock him down from doing things to make it pissed off. So then I go after neural first, then I strengthen, and then you get better. Hypermobility is just that, but just times 10. So fun stuff, training modifications. So on a macro scale, so I try to kind of cater it as much as I can from a macro, micro, and then like a game day. So like what applies for you guys. So from a macro scale, again, stretching is not going to work well from them. Mobility is actually going to come through solid movement patterns and loading. Hypermobility, the best example that I can use to kind of drive that point home is that when you're trying to teach somebody to squat or kettlebell swing or deadlift, the thought process is to start light and then add load. There are a few movements and few things in this world that actually are like almost the opposite is true. That's one of them. So like I always try to have somebody do a kettlebell swing more than what they think that they can do because it's going to make them do it properly. Squat, same thing. Like I would way rather have a person squat with a 40-pound weight than a 5-pound weight to learn how to squat because it's going to make them do it good. Where the hypermobility asterisk comes in is that then you need to even limit the range of motion a little bit more. Box squat versus traditional squat. Deadlift off of blocks or trap bar versus regular bar or XYZ. Add in some sort of training modification, but add more load quicker. They're going to do a lot better, a lot faster. So that's kind of where I was kind of going with that thought is solid movement, patterns, and loading. They need more of it in small ranges of motion, and you're going to get way more bang in the buck. Recovery modalities are like 25 on the list of importance, but the thing is that it's the fun thing that they know that they need to do. I need to stretch, I need to Theragun, I need to do this, I need to do that. They're going to be way better off just strength training. Again, strength never goes out of style. Cool, so then from a micro scale, this is what I would think about like a general basis of how I would train somebody that walked into a gym door to come see me. Okay, general warm up, again, get the blood moving, neural adaptations, specific warm-up, activation, movement, proprioception. So again, they have a bigger range of motion that they're trying to work in through. Proprioception for them, it's not impaired, it's just they need a little help. So like actually giving them things to work on from a proprioception standpoint is going to be massive. Power movements probably need to come in before compound movements because again, if I'm thinking about it from a neural adaptation standpoint, is that their power is going to get generated. It's going to be harder for them to generate it further down the workout. Right, and like obviously from an NCSA standpoint and the CSCS and all these other people, they're like, yeah, you should train power first. I think it's not that important for the general population. I think you can train power and strength pretty evenly across a whole domain of a workout. Where a hypermobility thing comes in is that their neural adaptation needs to happen. So I would train power before I would train strength. Because then in theory, then I want to train strength when they're already fatigued so that it really drives home neural activity anyways. So for them, like trying to bulk power in at the beginning would be cool. So again, fatigue isn't their friend because once they fatigue, they're not going to have as much control. It becomes less important as training age increases, right? So if I have a 13-year-old swimmer versus a 25-year-old swimmer, this doesn't necessarily apply as much because their training age, their adaptation, their proprioception is going to be pretty solidified at that point. but you guys treat with a lot of younger athletes, so this becomes more apparent for younger athletes. Train within windows, so again, that's kind of what I was saying before. So avoid max effort, extreme ranges of motion, box squat versus barbell back squat, trap bar deadlift versus straight bar deadlift, stuff like that. So try to train within certain windows. Compound movement, set parameters again. So external loading is their friend and parameters are their friend. So just having constraints and loading for them is going to be really good. Muscles operate the best at mid-ranges. So 90-degree angles in theory from a biomechanical standpoint. I don't think that's necessarily true, really. I think it's more like a 30-degree range within that middle range. So if you can put them in that middle range more often, they're going to be more successful. If they become more successful, they feel more successful. Once that happens, then it's a positive feedback loop. Meet day. So this is kind of what I was like thinking to try to make it a little bit more applicable for you guys. So I still fall into the camp of a proper warm-up for specific events, right? So power-based warm-up for your short sprint athletes, slow build for your endurance-based athletes. With that being said, is going after activation to get things more normal for them is going to be more beneficial in my personal opinion. So obviously you need to individualize as much as you can, but taking these things into consideration. Environment, equipment, how many races, and then knowing the athlete. So like again, for example, but Skylar, I wouldn't have Skylar do a quote unquote normal warm-up. He would be way better off like doing like a wall sit isometric hold to warm his legs up in a mid-range versus doing a bunch of air squats. Vice versa, in the upper body, a good plank, a good side plank for him would probably be more beneficial than doing some like banded scap work. It's a poor example, but it's a good example.
Like inchworms, push-up isos, that kind of
all that stuff, because he needs to get more normal. Cool, case study, college level swimmer. Basically, chief complaint is that he's getting slower in the pool. That was his like true north, right? Hey, I'm not doing as good as I was. Shoulders are fatiguing more than normal, wasn't able to old splits, wasn't able to accomplish movement, felt that they were not able to train. Tried most accessible modalities, especially on a D1 program. They have access to most things, and it still wasn't getting better. Quote unquote, I always hear something feels off. I always feel tight. I feel like I need to stretch. Those are like my three. If I were to bucket a hypermobile athlete, those would probably be my three things. So this is what we did. We did an evaluation. That's what I found on the left. Pretty standard. Where I kind of want to really kind of hone in on is the bottom part. So 3 out of 5 in a man muscle test is basically that he can't. So 3 out of 5 is that if you can hold the movement properly against gravity. In theory, he probably couldn't even do that. So I should give him like a 3-. Because again, everything that he did is he compensated through every other body part except what I was asking him to do. Where I really want to kind of hone in though is the 30-40% strength deficits in regards to normal, quote unquote. So again, we retested his scaption actually today, and he was up by 53% on his right side, 75% on his left side. So again, 30 to 40 is kind of a great area, but that's what we found during the evaluation. 6 weeks later, strength testing went up about 30% because he texted me that. Obviously, it's not the best. But this is where I'm going to go first. Felt better subjectively, felt better objectively, and then he continued to progress with homework and strengthening, right? So it comes in today, just on this morning, I feel better, I'm moving better. I ask him to do certain things, oh my God, it feels better. So again, I didn't do anything crazy. If anything, I probably underwhelmed the system too much. But at the same time too, is what I kind of told them from the very beginning is, we're going to try it, we're going to see what goes, see what happens. I have a pretty good basis of I think it's going to work, and it did. And again, I don't mean that arrogantly, it's just like, hey, I took low-hanging fruit, I drove home principles, and it seems to be working. So moral of the story, train low-hanging fruit. I'm a big low-hanging fruit guy, 2 birds, 1 stone guy. I really try to make things as simple as possible, as much as possible. What I've found out, the more that I practice and the more that I see stuff on Instagram and all the fancy stuff, I think it's all BS to a certain degree. Obviously, one of the best quotes I've ever heard, again, from one of my mentors is, something is going to work for everybody, but not one thing works for everybody. So even if you go find the most sexy thing on Instagram, it's going to work for somebody. That person probably just got lucky. That's a very big hyperbole, but more of the story is train low-hanging fruit. Most of the time what the person is feeling versus what actually is happening in reality is not the same. That's why, quote unquote, it's hard working with athletes, or I need to go do all this education or to work with athletes. It's like, yeah, it's to a degree. It's just making sure that like with what you're hearing versus what they feel versus what is actually happening are all kind of lining up. Most of the time it's not. Anatomy doesn't change based on the sport. A lat's a lat, shoulder's a shoulder. It's just then understanding with what demands are being put on it. Again, like what we were kind of talking about, like one of my, I guess, like big metrics, can you actually rotate 20% of your body weight? Most people can't. Is it what necessarily dictates me a return to throwing program versus a return to swim program versus, I don't know, an Olympic level swimmer? I don't know. Probably not, but it's a good place at least to start. And then if, again, it's like if I were to, in a perfect world, if I were to actually rotate against Michael Phelps' shoulder, I don't know what those numbers would have been.
It could be 5%.
It could have been 5%. I just don't know. But even then, it's like, is he a freak? Yeah. Would I use every person's training regimen based off of him? Not a chance. One, you don't know, but then two, it's like, again, he's one of them.
Scared.
Objective data should help. Again, it should. Based off of that conversation we just had, if I treat every single swimmer and get them to 20% extra in rotation strength, is that necessarily going to shave 10 seconds off? I don't know. But if they have pain and they can't perform certain movements that are being asked of them, strength is a good place to start. Especially for a hypermobile athlete, right? We're trying to get more strength, more neural activity.
Because some people say like, oh, KPIs don't matter. You don't need KPIs. But it's like, but then what are we doing? You know.
And that's the
It's
key.
like, how do we like what's the goal here? And
Absolutely.
we're just throwing poop at the wall and see what sticks.
So again, it's a really poor example, but it just happened, right? So hey, I'm going to do a manual muscle test, which is subjective. Even when you look at the research, it's about a 20% disparity between PT and VT. So the inter-rater reliability is really low when it comes to manual muscle test. Awesome. Can this girl run? Can she jump? Can she squat? Yeah, it looks good. Okay, cool. Objectively, she's still operating at a 20% deficit on a quad. That can't happen. But you wouldn't know that unless you test it. Is it right? I don't know. Is it going to get better? Probably. But is it like what's going to keep her from swimming? Not necessarily. But it could keep her from performing from 1 second shave. You just don't know. And I'm not willing to sleep at night knowing that I didn't at least try.
Right.
Again, Skylar, perfect example. Like, cool, let's do this. Let's see if you get stronger. Is it going to help directly? Hopefully. So that's what I kind of got on this case a little bit, is like you need to start writing down split times and like, let's actually make sure we're working on things that need to work. Because at the end of the day, it's like, sports are pretty simple. Can you move that weight? Can you throw that ball? Can you swim that fast? Objective. Cool? So I just threw a ton of information at you guys all at once. I apologize if I went through it really quickly. With that being said, any questions, comments, concerns? Anytime.
Appreciate your time.
Oh, always.